Hello, everyone, and welcome to our live webinar today. My name is Mark Alpert, joining you from Pegasus Communications. We're delighted to have Joel and Michelle Levy presenting today. Their presentation is entitled Teach Them Courage, Insights from the U.S. Army's Jedi Warrior Training Program. This will be an interactive 90-minute session aimed at leaders from all levels confronting complexity and uncertainty in their work environment. Before I introduce our speakers, I would just like to let you all know, and for those of you that have joined us before are well aware, that Joel and Michelle will be taking questions at specific breaks during the presentation today, and then again, as time permits at the end of our session. To get your questions asked, simply text or type your question into the chat box on the left side of your screen. I would ask that you not necessarily wait until it's time to ask the questions to type something in, because then we have that electronic time lag. So as soon as a question moves you or you have something that you want to ask, go ahead and type it in. We'll get it into the queue and then ask the question at the appropriate time. The Levys have also loaded a download document in the conference materials section block on the left side of your screen as well. It's a document that has links and things there for more information. So if you just double click on that document in the handout section, that'll open it up, and then you can save it to your own computer, and just I remind you to be patient there for a couple of seconds while it downloads. If you want to wait until the end of the presentation to download that document, you feel free to stay online and do it then. So, as a quick introduction, Joel and Michelle Levy are founders of the International Center for Corporate Culture and Organizational Health at Interworks Technology, Inc. On the faculty of the University of Minnesota Medical School, Mahidol University in Thailand, the Indian Institute of Management in India, and they have served as co-directors of the Center for Corporate Culture and Organizational Health at the Institute for Health and Productivity Management. They are core faculty for the International Center for Organizational Design, directors of clinical programs at group health and children's medical centers, and directed advanced bio-cybernetic training for the U.S. Army Special Forces Ultimate Warrior Program, which you will hear much more about in a minute. Their pioneering work has inspired leaders in hundreds of organizations around the globe, including NASA, World Bank, Intel, Shell, MIT, Boeing, HP, the Clinton Global Initiative, and the MD Anderson Cancer Center. Joel and Michelle are co-authors of many, many published works, including Corporate Culture and Organizational Health, Wisdom at Work, Living in Balance, Luminous Mind, Focused Mind State, Learning Organizations, and The New Bottom Line. The Levys are based in Seattle, Washington, and Hawaii, where they are actually online and joining us from this afternoon, or this morning for them. So with that, I say let's get started, and we'll turn it over to you. Welcome, Joel and Michelle.
Thank you, Mark.
Good morning to you all, or afternoon, depending on the time zone that you're in. We're grateful to have this opportunity to explore quite a fascinating story with you today about the work that we did with the U.S. Army Special Forces. But our main mission today is to really explore some of the themes and practices and disciplines that were essential to the success of that program and their extreme relevance for those of us living in today's world and on the challenging realm of opportunities and challenges that our world presents to us at this time. So though we'll share many reflections and stories about the Jedi Warrior program specifically, we'll also try and bridge this into the realm of relevance for those of us working in organizations and communities around the world in these somewhat challenging times. One of the core disciplines that is essential to this work is the practice of mindfulness, the cultivation in an intentional way of a mindful, clear quality of presence. And as we begin, just to begin with the practice, we'd invite you to just look into the arena of your own mind as we begin, and just to notice and discern in whatever way they present themselves to you the questions that may be in your own mind, the inclinations, the interests, the curiosities that draw you to participate today, and to raise those to a level of conscious awareness by searching for those, by recognizing them, by even articulating those to yourself. And if you'd like to, please feel free to just make a note of those interests or questions that might be present for you in the chat box, and we can just check our collective pulse for the kinds of interests and questions that may be present for us as we begin. For many of us that have been involved in the Pegasus communication and learning community and the systems thinking conferences, we're familiar with Robert Quinn's book, Deep Change, and I think this quote really speaks to many of the dynamics of what we're talking about today. The fact that deep change within ourselves is related to creating deep change in our organizations and our world, and that as we transform ourselves, as we make deep change within ourselves and awaken to a new view, a new paradigm of how we see ourselves and our world, then that equips us with the capacity to create the changes that we'd like to see in the world around us. There's this phrase VUCA that came out of the military arena originally to describe the kinds of circumstances and environments that people were functioning in. This notion of working in circumstances that are highly volatile, extremely uncertain, increasing levels of complexity and ambiguity, and how can we work with these? And the Army War College at one point took on the nickname of VUCA University. And what we've seen, especially in recent years, and I think especially since 9/11 and the meltdown of the economy and the growing concerns over the environment, is that we're all living in a VUCA environment. And what we like to explore today is how we can transform this volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity into greater sense of vision, understanding, clarity, agility, and some of the positive qualities that can be drawn by transforming ourselves and learning how to do that together. So the invitation came to us to design the Ultimate Warrior training program for the U.S. Army Special Forces shortly after they released a study and a report called the Suicide Wall Study, which indicated that more than twice as many men and women committed suicide after they returned from the war in Southeast Asia than died in combat. So you could imagine standing in front of the Vietnam War Memorial and having it be 3 times larger than it actually is. And to just appreciate the senior officers that approached us and said, we want to develop some kind of training to equip people to go into the next arenas that our missions may take us into and be better prepared than we were for Southeast Asia. But we don't know what to do, and we're coming to you and asking you to put together a program that might help us equip these teams of Special Forces troops who might be in a position to start or stop the next war with a set of skills that could allow them to go into these kinds of circumstances and not come home so badly damaged. And the relevance of this for us today is highlighted by a recent report that was released that says that the mental health hospitalizations in the military have now topped the injuries, and that in today's military scenario with the ongoing conflicts in the Middle East, that the impacts on people are extreme and growing. And in the last paragraph here on this slide, the 4 mental health issues: depression, substance abuse, anxiety, adjustment problems, such as PTSD, cost the Pentagon $488 years of lost duty in 2009. And you can imagine the impact on people's lives, on their families, on their communities. So the kinds of disciplines and training that we're talking about here has extreme relevance, I think, for many of us trying to cope with the circumstances of today's world.
We'd like to invite you now to take a few moments for another reflective meditation or contemplation here, and consider if you had the opportunity to spend 6 months full-time teaching an intensive program like this to men, in our case, but in today's world, likely men and women who might be in a position to start or stop the next world war, the next great conflagration, what do you think would be most vitally important for you to teach them? That's one half of the contemplation. And also to consider, if you yourself were a member of such a team and you knew that you might be called upon to show up in this way, what kind of training would you want most to be able to prepare yourself for this mission? So just take a few moments, and if you'd like to chat your reflections on, so we can all get a sense for what insights or themes come up and speak to you, that would be really helpful.
So yes, please share your reflections in the chat. And for our hosts, we're not seeing any chat showing up on our screen, so if we're missing anything, please bring that up for us. Okay. So this quote by William James, who is essentially the father of Western psychology, has extreme relevance for the territory that we're exploring here. He says, "The greatest thing in all education is to make the nervous system our ally instead of our enemy." And that was a huge piece of our work with this program. We had the men for 6 months full-time. They pulled no other duty during that time. And we had a laboratory with about $200,000 worth of cyber physiology equipment to train them how to control their brain waves and their blood pressure, their internal states of being, their muscle tension, to keep their hands warm in cold weather environments. Because we had the science and the technology, and that we could really teach people using those kinds of methods to develop greater mastery over their minds and their bodies. We also took them on a month-long silent contemplative retreat, mindfulness training retreat, and were able to do a lot of intensive work with them psychologically and with their families. And all that was supplemented by about 2.5 to 3 months of our time doing field exercises. One of the most important parts of the program for us was the pre-work we did in preparation for the program, because we had nearly 3 years of time before that to do some research, and Michelle's going to tell you more about that.
So during these 3 years, we had the amazing opportunity, to go and meet with many of our mentors and most respected teachers, researchers from around the world, and to interview them and ask them the same question we asked you a few moments ago. And most specifically, if you had that opportunity to work with this group of people, what would you feel is most important to teach them? What would you recommend for us as the most important things to focus on? And one of these great mentors was a man whose picture is on the screen now, Dzong Rinpoche, who was the abbot of the largest monastic university in Tibet, and an incredible teacher, deep thinker. And we spoke with him through a translator and asked him this question, and the response that came back to us was, teach them courage. The most important thing you can do is teach them courage. And that became an amazing reflective contemplation for Joel and I. What does he mean? Throughout the whole 6 months, we would keep coming back to Dzong Rinpoche said that we should teach them courage. These guys have incredible courage on an outer physical plane of existence. And so he must be speaking about a different level of courage. And we began to probe that and have greater insights into that. And here's this quote from Lao Tzu, speaks to another dimension of inward courage. And what we actually found out as time went on and actually continued to keep finding out that in Tibetan language, words have often many, many levels of meaning. And the Tibetan word that was translated as courage could also have been translated as patience and as forgiveness, which proved to be very, very revealing and insightful for us throughout the course. And it wasn't actually until the Pegasus seminar last fall, there was a Tibetan translator at our program, and we were speaking with him, and he said, and another dimension of courage could be translated from the Tibetan as heart power, that fearless capacity to be present to whatever is occurring in the moment without closing one's heart down to it.
So another way to frame this, it comes back to this quality of being present, of having the courage to show up and to be fully awake and in the midst of the intensity of the circumstances that we find ourselves involved with, and not go into distraction, not go into mental dullness, but to really show up, feel the burn, embrace the complexity and the ambiguity of circumstances, and keep our minds and hearts clear and open enough that we can figure out what response would be most indicated. It's this great quote from Harry Truman where he says, "Leaders must have strong minds, ready to accept facts as they are." And the Army, in subsequent years from our program, has developed the Battle Mind program, how to armor your mind. And the following few slides here are drawn from that set of slides. And you can see here this notion of mental toughness and then mindfulness of feelings, being mindful of the emotional states that one may experience and all of their intensity and complexity, and being able to hold those, as well as being mindful of our thoughts, the narratives that we're having, the stories that we're telling ourselves. One technique that we learned from a friend who's an anthropologist, that's a mindfulness technique, is to be mindful of the thoughts that we're generating and to see whether those are self-sabotaging or helpful to us, and to discern the difference between, are these stories that don't need to happen, or are these healing stories? A story that doesn't need to happen is driving over the speed limit and thinking I'm going to get a ticket, or preparing for a presentation and thinking, this isn't going to go well. And when we see those kinds of thoughts in our mind, where we might fail in our mission, to be able to notice those and say to ourselves, and this is a story that doesn't need to happen. And at the same time, as we recognize other states of mind that may be more helpful, like this is going to be a great presentation, or this is going to turn out well, or I'm going to get to this meeting on time, to recognize, and this is a healing story, and to be able to tell the difference between those. So there's a quality that's being cultivated, go back one slide here, of being able to be present enough that we hear the whispers, the little indicators that something is calling for attention, rather than allowing those circumstances to escalate into screams. And one of the main ways that we've come to frame the practice of mindfulness is captured in this slide, to cultivate a quality of clear presence, just that sense of, I'm here and awake and present. And then with that clear presence, to rest in or embrace the flow of our experience, to be mindful of the natural flow of the breath and thoughts and emotions and sensations as they course through the stream of our experience, and to hold those all with a great courage, with great compassion. And that this can be really a fundamental practice, like your mental screensaver of this deep quality of mindful, clear presence and courage that allows you to have the strength to show up and be present. And this notion that the more we listen, the more we will hear. And the more we hear, the more and more deeply we will understand. So, as Einstein reminded us, given the many problems that we face in our world, we really do need to access a new level of consciousness, a new way of thinking if we're to survive, if we're to flourish, if we, our communities, our organizations, our world is going to make it. So let's talk a little bit about where this program came from, its genesis. This program came about in the early 80s when we were still in the midst of the Cold War. The mind race was on with lots of research and psyops going on in the Soviet Union, compelling us in the United States to get with the program and be involved with this. So many universities were involved in this work. I was involved in some of this research at the University of Washington in those early days. In the midst of that time, also, Jim Channon, who's well known to many of us in the Pegasus learning community, and in the realms of organizational transformation, Jim launched the first Earth Battalion and it published a manual called Evolutionary Tactics, a manual for the first Earth Battalion, which outlined a vision for a mythical force within the Army called the First Earth Battalion that would be functioning with the skills of great warriors and the discipline of that, but also the ethics and the moral grounding of monks. And the vision was that these would be like a planetary peacekeeping force. And it was out of this fertile ground of circumstances combined with the great heartache of what had happened in Vietnam that this program, the Jedi Warrior, Ultimate Warrior training program, came about. And as the Army described it, this following set of slides comes from the after-action report and from the specs that we designed the program for. Trojan Warrior was initiated as an experimental training program designed to enhance the individual soldier and team abilities in a holistic way. And our mandate was to make full use of emergent human technologies to enhance physiological and psychological awareness in the control and special forces detachments. The military environment at that time had become exceedingly complex, extremely demanding. Individuals were called to adapt to very VUCA circumstances and to respond and recover, and we were called to design a program that could meet those needs. And we drew from, it's a very holistic, integral design. We were working the interior development, the psychological, a lot of psychological training, mastery of attention, physiological control, but also working with two of the best teams in the Army at that point to help them develop these capacities. And when the review team looked at our initial proposal at West Point, they said, this is the most extraordinary, exquisite orchestration of human technology we've ever seen. And then we also worked with Michael Murphy and George Leonard, who are pioneers in the human potential movement, who said, this is really the most advanced leadership development program to be offered in modern times. So we felt quite privileged to be able to participate in this. So here's a glimpse of some of the mission-specific goals that we were asked to help the soldiers develop their capacities for. And as you look at these, you might consider how do some of these relate to the kinds of challenges that you might face in your business environment or in your organization. In today's world, developing confidence in our leadership abilities in the midst of so many unknown circumstances, to develop greater acceptance and attunement to other cultures, to take a more holistic or integral approach. These are clearly relevant for many of us in the arenas that we operate in. And the basic training elements, we did advanced physical fitness training, the biocybernetic and the mind fitness training. The Aikido piece was a very strong piece. Richard Heckler was our primary sensei in running the Aikido, and Bud Cook, I'd really like to acknowledge, initially launched the program with us in terms of the Aikido piece. We did psychological work, mission-related skills, and spent a lot of time in the field, and we worked with the men's families, with their spouses, their significant others, and their children, and we were training the men to be trainers. During that time, we spent close to 3 months in the field where they really had a chance to test what they were learning in the laboratory of mission simulation environments. And our teams were able to excel on many of the mission simulations that other teams had never succeeded in. So some of the primary tenets: increased awareness of mind-body-emotion relationship leads to greater control over every area of performance, and greater control leads to more appropriate, powerful, skillful action, all of which promote winning and survival on the battlefield and in the realms of business. As we consider the notion of mental training, to understand that as we seek to understand our minds and to develop them at greater and greater levels of capacity, that we're beginning to recognize inner strengths that haven't been developed. We're beginning to encounter aspects of ourselves that haven't been faced or understood, and to dissolve our reactivities and likelihood of being triggered by those. And that mental training is gradually going to change our mental and our neurological baseline. That the mind training is a process of becoming a better human being, not just for our own sake, but for the benefit and the sake of others as well. As we mentioned, we had a laboratory with about $200,000 worth of biofeedback equipment, teaching the men to understand their minds and bodies, and it was amazing to us to see how little training these men had in mastery of attention, in emotional intelligence, in just basic skills for understanding what their minds were, how they worked, and how to optimize those. Gradually, this paradigm has expanded. This is a model that comes from the West Point Military Academy, where they are beginning to do a bit more mind fitness training now. They've got a great program there where they're helping develop the cognitive foundations of beliefs and values, cognitive understanding, help people be intentional about goal setting, develop greater mindfulness and mastery of attention, master stress, work with visualization, creative imagination as means of developing greater peak performance. Our program really had a chance to advance the action on this in a big way. We also did a lot of work with Aikido, and Chris Thorson, I'm happy to see you on the line here. Chris is another colleague in the Aikido work. This whole notion that when open systems move toward complexity rather than away from it, when we're able to embrace the intensity and complexity of our circumstances with greater courage in an attuned and resonant way, then the whole system becomes more stable, more flexible, more adaptive, more energized, more coherent. And so the Aikido training really became a vehicle for the men to test what they were learning in the lab with us in the mind training in simulation environments where they were able to interact with each other on the mat doing Aikido, and to see their minds and bodies at play in that kind of way. Another exercise that we did was a month-long silent mindfulness retreat called the Encampment, where we took the men to a Boy Scout camp in southern New Hampshire, and this is a month-long silent mindfulness retreat where the men really had to muster greater courage in some cases than they'd ever had to sit quietly and look deeply into their own minds. And for many of the men that we worked with, this was one of the most challenging and terrifying pieces of the training that we had, and many of them were quite apprehensive about that. But at the end of that encampment time, as one of the team leaders said, I thought I was operating at 90 or 95% optimal performance, but I realized that I may not even be operating at 50%. This really widened my scope of looking at things. Finally, I learned much about my attitude of my teammates and their personal code of discipline. So it was a very illuminating experience. So we'll share some data here, just overall increases in these different factors that were all part of the charter that we had for the 6 months of training. Some of the mission enhancements, this is increases from the baseline that they started with. Some of the physical enhancements. The team enhancements. We spent close to $30,000 just processing data. We collected an enormous amount of information on the men, psychologically, physiologically, and this is kind of a composite of many of those different data streams all converging here. And at the end of the program, as stated, the successful completion of the Trojan Warrior, Jedi Warrior program has placed the Army at the forefront of human performance technology by validating in a controlled, measured manner the holistic approach of mind, body, and team training. And the Army has demonstrated its commitment to providing soldiers with the very best training that's available. So what we found over the years is that the work that we did with the Special Forces really opened the way for us to step more deeply into the mainstream of the corporate arena and the organizational arena in a way that just brought all of the wealth of the research that we've been able to do on the Army project.
In fact, when we started working with corporations again after we came out of the Army project, and we spoke a little bit about the work that we'd just been engaged in, countless leaders, vice presidents, and CEOs that we were working with at the time would say, that's what we need. We need an ultimate warrior training program here at our place. We're living in a war zone. Bombs are dropping every day. I mean, there's an immediate sense of resonance and capacity to relate to the kinds of trainings and the need for that kind of training within an organizational arena.
So we'd like to talk a little bit about some of the science behind the mind training work and to talk about this notion of neuroplasticity. And this is one of the best models that we've found to really explain this. And it's built on this notion that what gets fired gets wired, that as we intentionally focus our mental attention, that it actually activates and energizes specific circuitry of our brain and builds more robust connections in that circuitry of the brain, so that the mind is literally sculpting and changing the brain. So here's a way to understand that. There's the field of our lived experience, whatever experiences that we have. And those help shape our beliefs, our worldview, our identity. Those beliefs and identities then determine what we value and care about. And what we care about, we invest our attention in. We pay attention to the things that we value. And as we pay attention to those specific domains of our experience, it activates the neural circuits involved with paying attention to those and makes those connections more robust, and then that sculpts and changes the structure of the brain, sets certain filters of perception that are biased by what we care about, and those in turn then can influence the way that we experience our lives. So that what we're paying attention to is constantly shaping and sculpting the quality of our mind. And the quality of our mind is constantly shaping and structuring our brains. And we'd like to share a study that comes from the proceedings from the National Academy of Science that it was on a group of virtuoso practitioners of mental development, people that had logged between 15,000, 30,000, or 45,000 hours of disciplined mental training in intensive contemplative retreat environments. And their brains were compared to a group of novices who had been trained in a mental discipline for 1 week. So as you look at the illustrations here, the head that is more in blue tones at the top of the screen there, that's the brains of the novices, people that had been introduced to a discipline of mental training for 1 week and were doing the best they could. And you see the level of activation across their brain while they're engaged in the mental training. To the right, you have a composite of the neural activation patterns of the group of virtuoso contemplatives. And you can see it looks like they're running completely different operating systems here. And if you look down at the graph on the bottom, where it has 15,000, 30,000, 45,000 hours at the bottom, you see that the degree of effects in neurological change and activation is relative to, even amongst those virtuosos, the degree of practice that they've had. So those that had trained most intensively for, let's say, 45,000 hours had much stronger patterns of activation and neural connectivity across the brain than the novices did. And this would be true with people in any discipline. If you took novices and virtuosos in music, in dance, in public relations, people that really have developed any kind of skill. Some of the popular studies that many of us have read says 10,000 hours is what it takes to get to a basic level of mastery. Well, here's some of the neurological correlates of that. And here on this next slide, you can see that the practitioners, there were 8 of them at this point in the study. Now this research is advanced, and I think they've got close to 20 long-term practitioners that have been studied, are producing far greater impacts of neurological transformation than, again, the controls on the left side there. And this is relative to the amount of training and practice that people are engaged in. So what we're learning is that the dimensions of well-being, being the mind, the brain, and the field of relationships, that as we engage in these kinds of practices, that our mental and our neurological system becomes more integrated. And some of the characteristics of that integrated state are that we're more psychologically, emotionally, and neurologically more flexible, more adaptive, more coherent, more energized and stable. This research is just exploding now into so many different domains where the contemplative inner scientists are meeting with the people, the scientists that have big laboratories and research capacities. There are lots of big conferences that are happening, and there's this dialogue that's taking place at this time in our world that is extremely exciting to understand the true dimensions of human potential. There's a new lab that was just begun at Stanford here, the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education at Stanford University. And this is a slide from a presentation from Richard Davidson, who runs the Laboratory for Affective Neuroscience at University of Wisconsin in Madison. So it's an exciting time for those of us that have been involved with this work for many years. One point to make here is that in terms of the neurological transformation that happens, that as we observe and attend to things with greater mindful attention, as we begin to reflect more deeply on the nature of our experience and come to those moments of insight and aha and revelation where there's that sense of, oh, I understand this, that those understandings can then lead us to change our action. that it's in the moments when we really, within ourselves, generate a strong dedication or commitment or intention that the most neurological change takes place. And that to realize in your own life that coming to an insight is powerful, but getting to the point where you're actually saying, and I'm really going to commit to living in a certain way, that's really where the transformation takes place in terms of some of the neural circuitry. In the work we do in organizations to introduce this notion of mindfulness, we do a lot of work to help people just rest in a state of clear, mindful attention and begin to just be more attentive of what are they noticing. So as you're listening to this, just look around the room that you're sitting in and just see what's streaming in through your sense doors, the sounds, the colors, the shapes, the sensations in your body that are present for you. As you rest mindfully in the easy, natural flow of your breath, notice what emotions may be present for you: curiosity, excitement, boredom, frustration, elation, whatever it may be. As those emotions arise in the mind, notice the narratives, the thoughts that are present in the mind, your desires, the intentions that are present. As we cultivate the capacity to hold the intention, to pay attention, to have the courage to show up more fully in our lives, radical transformation can take place within our brains and within our minds. And some of the recent research that is emerging is showing that through the practice of mindful attention, that the neural circuits in the prefrontal lobes of the cortex are becoming more robustly developed. And those circuits knit together the cortex, the limbic system, the deeper structures of the brain. And as people practice intentionally cultivating a quality of mindful, clear presence, what happens is that these 9 executive functions become more fully developed, and the neurological structures of those parts of the brain actually grow thicker and stronger and more robust with connections. So these 9 elements include a greater capacity for regulating our bodies, a greater attunement in our communication, a greater ability to maintain a sense of emotional balance rather than going out of balance or into reactivity, the ability to pause before we act, response flexibility, a capacity for registering more deeply what other people are experiencing in an empathetic way, more insight due to the more robust neural connectivity, a capacity to approach situations that previously were regarded in a fearful way, and to investigate them and to resolve those situations rather than withdraw from them.
This one ties in directly with the Teach Them Courage principle, that capacity to be fearless in the face of one's fears, even, to be present and willing to show up and experience, explore what is really happening.
There's one study done by Richard Davidson on teaching mindfulness to people in a corporate environment that was very highly stressful environment, and people before the study said on all the interviews and tests they did, registered being extremely anxious and hypervigilant, and the parts of the brain associated with that kind of stressfulness were highly activated. And then they were trained for 8 weeks in the discipline of mindfulness, being more fully present, having the courage to embrace their experience more completely and objectively and compassionately. And after 8 weeks, what happened was the parts of the brain that were activated previously when they were anxious, those areas had really quieted down, and that was on the right prefrontal cortex. And the left prefrontal cortex area was more fully activated, and they were reporting feeling happier and less stressed and more confident. initially the data was interpreted to think, oh, they're activating their happiness centers. But upon further analysis, what was revealed was that the parts of the brain that were lighting up as people really cultivated greater mindful attention were actually structures of the brain related to approaching difficult circumstances, being less afraid, being more courageous to embrace life more fully with greater confidence, greater skill, I think really related to these 9 factors that we see on the screen here. So, and that those results of the mind training resulted not only in significant neurological change, but also increases in the immunological viability for people so that there were more robust immune response, and those neurological and psychological changes endured for at least 4 months after the formal training was over. So what we see here, one model that we use, we published this in Esquire magazine at one point with George Leonard in an article on executive mind fitness training. There's this notion of, how confusion and ignorance in our lives leads to greater doubt, that feeds our lethargy and depression, our distraction and our mindless inattention, which further feeds our ignorance and confusion. That through this kind of mind training, what we're able to do is to develop greater confidence, which builds greater insight, which builds our confidence, increases our energy, activates a greater sense of focus and discipline, which can then be cultivated through attention and mindfulness, which then leads to greater insight. The more we listen, the more we will hear. The more we hear, the more and more deeply we will understand. So we'd like to talk briefly about how some of this mind training and neurological training shows up in team and group performance. We were given 2 teams. One had been together with the Army. We had been given 2 teams. One had been together for a long time. They were strongly bonded. They were more kind of old style, really good, strong, stable team. The great leader. The other was a new team, had just come together. They had a very strong spirit, but they hadn't been together as long, and they had a leader with a different mental temperament who actually had some attitudes about the program. He had strong transference issues with the leader of our team, who was a former Marine, who reminded him of his father, and in a not positive kind of way, and he didn't really understand why his team had to be subjected to this kind of training, and he didn't encourage his men to participate as fully, and there was a kind of cognitive dissonance within himself that was generously shared with his team, and led to some interesting dynamics. And just a sense that our emotions are contagious, that through the networks of our mirror neurons, our inner states of being are telegraphed to other people. And that we can't leave our feelings at the door. The emotions will be present in our bodies, in the workplace. Brilliant work from Paul Ekman on microfacial movements and how we convey our state, and our bodies never lie. Just the notion of this and how that shows up. So to understand that each of us, as we move through the world, are broadcasting through the waveforms of our beating heart that reach far beyond the surface of our body to the microfacial movements that we're generating, that our internal state of being is broadcasting loud and clear to other people. Well, we were involved in intensive neurological training with the men and brainwave biofeedback training, and we were able to analyze the data of kind of the composite neurological changes for each of the teams individually. And on the left, you've got the team 065 that was with the leader who didn't really encourage his men to participate very strongly in the program.
Joel and Michelle, are you still there?
I can hear some faint talking in the background.
I was wondering if maybe they put their mute on.
So, is there a problem with the audio?
Oh, you just came back. We lost you there, Joel and Michelle. We lost you for a few seconds.
Okay, are we back on now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, good. And the sound quality's good?
Yes.
Okay, let us know if it goes off. Sorry. So, did you hear the part where we're talking about the comparison between the two teams here, and one being severely diminished as compared to the other?
Yeah, you were just starting to explain how the graph on the left represented the team with the leader who didn't support the cause wholeheartedly, and that's when we lost you.
Okay, and the one on the right is the team that was highly supported by their leader. And here are some of the measures and comparing between the two teams. Oh, and the observation on this by one of our colleagues who helped analyze the data was, he looked at this and he said, was the team on the left on drugs? He just couldn't understand why the brain power of the team on the left there would be so suboptimal. Here's some of the data, just looking at a comparison between the teams in terms of various measures of the team enhancements, and you can see 062 was so strong in terms of their development, and 065 was really flailing in many ways in terms of their capacity to really develop themselves. So it could be said that our greatest advantage in working together in our organizations, in our teams, is our collective intelligence, our collective brain power that we have within our organizations. And you could say that if you want to maximize the productivity and get the best results from your staff, then remember, you want your people to be in an optimal state of mind and brain and relationships to do their work. And each of us, as we work with our own state of being and presence as a leader, can support or diminish other people's capacity to perform at their best. So the invitation here, the lesson to be drawn, is to manage ourselves, to be mindful and disciplined, and to take responsibility for our impacts on the ability of others to do their best work. So I think this would be a good time to welcome some questions from the field here.
Sure. We do have a couple of questions that have come in, and a whole bunch just mentioned they lost audio, so hopefully they're back and hearing everything fine now as well. But one of the questions that came in is inquiring about whether or not you have, or if there are mindful assessments that exist.
We have one. Yes, we have one short one that we use in some of the programs that we do, and I'm sure that there are different ones out there that measure different levels of mastery of attention. I'm sure there's a lot of psychological tools. We use quite a few of those during the program itself when we're collecting data. We just have a short one-pager that we often use in the organizational programs that we do that is a reflective learning piece for people to just consider some of the ways that they pay attention and could learn to develop a greater mastery of attention.
As a quick follow-up to that kind of a question concerning the mindfulness skills and how you're able to practice with all of the noise and the bombardment of information and the things that people are hit with every day, is the only way to develop these kind of skills to go on a month-long solo encampment, or are they things that you can find time to do during with all the other things you do every day?
With all the other things you do every day, whatever you're doing, there you are. So if you're walking from your bus to your office, if you're talking with people, when we introduce the practice of mindfulness in the organizations that we work with, usually the first exercise that we'll teach people is mindful dialogue. And I'd invite all of our listeners here to run this experiment. Just as you approach some encounter later on today, generate the intention to be as fully present as you can during that encounter. And be mindful of whenever your mind may wander to other things, and if it wanders, bring it back, and just use the discipline to be not only fully present, but to be vigilant, to have enough self-reflective awareness that you can recognize when your mind wanders and come back, and just really hold the intention to listen deeply, not only to the person that you're speaking with, but also to listen deeply to your own inner experience, what your thoughts are, your emotional responses, the sensations in your body, your desires, your intentions as you're communicating. So this can be cultivated quite adeptly. In a few weeks, we'll be working with one of our corporate clients to actually do a mindfulness-based urban retreat in the workplace, where we'll do some formal practice together at the beginning of each day. People will go into their days really taking the whole week as a mind fitness training retreat, as a mindfulness retreat. So they'll do their phone calls, they'll have their meetings, they'll attend whatever interactions that they are, holding the discipline to be fully present. And then at the end of each day, we'll come back, we'll reflect, we'll do some practice together. So when we worked with Hewlett,
take it home. And the retreat doesn't just end when the workday ends, but it will be a whole week of how do we integrate this cultivation of mindful presence, deep listening, showing up as fully as we can, even as we go back home, and then, with our families and our relationships into our sleep, and then come back tomorrow and continue and reflect and build on it.
And mindful driving. When we worked with Hewlett Packard, we were two of the main consultants for the largest division at HP for many years. One of the 5 core values for that division of Hewlett Packard was mindfulness. So, there really is the potential in any work team or unit, let alone an individual life, to really say attention is our most valuable resource. And we're really going to nurture and cultivate that as a key business success strategy. In some of our work at Intel, we did work around attention leadership. And we just did a workshop at Pratt Whitney Rocketdyne for scientists from NASA and Jet Propulsion Laboratories on mindful leadership. So these practices are really made for everyday life. And if you have an opportunity to do an intensive month-long retreat at some point, that's great, but don't wait for them. Just begin with your next mindful cup of Java or conversation or walk to your next meeting.
Great, very good. We've got actually a bunch of questions that are coming in. How about just one or two more, and we'll see. I want to keep my eye on the time here. I think as another good question here, follow on to what you're saying, the willingness to show up in business or corporate environment is the key to cultural change. Could you elaborate on any specific programs to raise that in an organization?
Well, I think we just talked about a number of them. Generally, the kind of model that we've found is best is to bring people together for 2 or 3 days of intensive training to ground in various skills around many of the models that we've shared so far, and to really have time not only to cultivate mindfulness, but to do a lot of deep reflection on what these kinds of themes and issues and disciplines mean for people in their lives and their work, how these translate into the business environment, and then give people a number of weeks or a month to go out and actually engage in the experiment of their life and to live in the laboratory of their daily work life, and then come back together for a number of days to deepen in the practice, to share reflections and questions on what's been learned, and then to go back out into the work environment again with a bit more technique and skill and some of the maps and models more fully loaded, and then come back and reflect again. So what we found is that spreading training out over time building in really clear guidelines for integrating practice into daily life and how to apply the many different kinds of principles, and is just a great way to do this kind of work and to really build it into the fabric of a whole organization.
One more question and then we'll move on. Is mind training related to specific competencies desired only, or is it more broad than that?
I would say that's a both and. One can apply it for developing certain competencies, but certainly it is more broad than that. It's a general cultivation of the quality of one's presence at every moment in one's life, at work, beyond work. It's developing this capacity to attend with intention and with an attitude of mind and of heart that really welcomes and embraces the flow of daily experience. So it's really a much broader state of being that one is speaking about here with mind fitness training.
Very good. Why don't we move along?
Okay. Dee Hock, who founded the Visa card industry, has spoke at many of the Pegasus conferences in the past, and we love this quote from him where he says, "Here's the real heart and soul of the matter of leadership. If we seek to lead, invest 50% of your time and attention leading yourself, your purpose, ethics, principles, motivation, and conduct." And just this notion of investing this attention in really developing our own capacities here. Here's a model that comes from some of the emotional intelligence work that is also put into an integral matrix here of the inner self and the outer self, the inner social, the outer social. And I think you can see here where some of these qualities that we have the capacity to develop, the capacity for greater mindful self-awareness, greater capacity of self-management, greater social intelligence, and to work well in relationships, that all of these can be cultivated and developed. Do we still have the audio?
Yes, we do.
Okay. So this is one model that we can look at this work through. As we translate this into some of the organizational environments that we work in, we'll oftentimes break this down into 5 primary disciplines. And I think we have time to go through these and some pieces on resilience here. I think we've got plenty of time for that, plus some more questions. So let's look at these one by one. So if you're interested in becoming more fully involved in this kind of work, here's some guidelines for you, some things you can begin to start to do even right now in this moment. Clarify your intention. Why are you here? Why are you making the phone call that you're making? What is leading you to direct your attention to opening that email instead of another one? Begin to live and work on purpose and be more mindful of the values and the priorities that you hold and the intentions that drive your choices in life. A second one is to just cultivate the qualities of mental clarity and stability to reduce mental agitation and dullness. One way to do this is with simple focusing techniques, so that, let's say, as you breathe in, you could say to yourself softly, focus, and as you breathe out, flow. Focus, flow. Or here, now, here, now. And you begin to cultivate a sense of flow and continuity in the stream of your conscious awareness rather than a sputtering, sparking, flickering, incoherent state. You begin to build the mind to be more like a laser beam that is streaming in the clarity and the presence of the moment rather than just constantly being interrupted and distracted. We talked about mindfulness quite a bit. Really, as you look out through your eyes, know what you're seeing as different thoughts or mental states arise and feel different. See what those are. Just be courageous enough to show up for your life and be present. We've done a survey with thousands of people now, asking them, and you could try this if you're listening. In one hand, reach out and hold all the moments of your life that you truly are present. If somebody's talking to you, you're listening. If you're eating, you're tasting the food. If you're reading, your mind is with what you're reading. If you're driving, you're really there. Hold all the moments that you're really present for and courageous enough to live your life fully. In the other hand, hold all the moments that you're distracted, spaced out, mindless, running on automatic pilot. People are talking, you're not listening. When we have done this with probably tens of thousands of our clients over the years, the average percent that most people would say that they're really showing up for their life is somewhere between 5 and 12%, which is humbling. So you could imagine, if if your child gets to be 10 years old and you were only there, let's say even 20%, would that be good enough for you? If you live to be 100 years old and you were only showing up for 10 or 20% of that time, is that good enough for you? So the potential here to reclaim the lost territories of our life more fully are enormous. And as we apply ourselves, as we hold the intention to listen more deeply, be more fully present, we're actually developing more neurological capacity to do that and be successful with that. One of the other mind fitness disciplines that you can work with is just to make more time for deep reflection. Who are you? What's important to you? Where are you going in your life? What kind of legacy do you want to leave? We do this in maybe a less disciplined way when we think, how am I going to deal with this challenging situation? Or what's the right design for this presentation or this new product? And we really wrap our minds around that. To cultivate this capacity of deep reflection as a discipline is really, really extremely fruitful, because this leads to transformation in our identity and our way of life.
And also to have a group, a working team, members of a leadership team where people at any level in the organization engage in reflection together, to have part of a meeting, even if it's only 5%, sometime where we're not just moving from item to item, task to task on an agenda, but to really pause and check in with ourselves individually and as a team to reflect on how we're doing, what's important to us, where, to really give that kind of level of deep insight and reflection and feedback to each other is so critical.
Thanks, Michelle. Let's talk a little bit about resilience. What we're finding in the world that we live in and work in these days, that there's just an extreme importance to the theme of resilience and change resilience in these crazy times. And would like to just offer 3 keys to developing greater resilience in the midst of change and challenge and the VUCA-ness of the world in which we live. So the first one really relates to the topic of this webinar. It's like the courage to keep our eyes wide open as we embrace the reality that's presenting itself to us. This notion that the people that are the most resilient really approach the challenging circumstances of their life and embrace them straight on and do whatever it is needed to survive or thrive in the circumstances of their life. And we might ask ourselves, do we embrace and accept life experiences in a realistic way, or are we more prone to denial, rationalization, wishful thinking? Back to that piece from Truman that we talked about earlier, leaders must have strong minds ready to accept and embrace the facts and the circumstances of life as they are. There's this beautiful quote from Sogyal Rinpoche that we used quite a bit during the work we did with the Special Forces, where he says, to be a spiritual warrior, means to develop a special kind of courage, one that's innately intelligent, gentle, and fearless. Spiritual warriors can still be frightened. We're mindful of the fear. We have the courage to embrace that fear, but even so, they're courageous enough to taste suffering, to relate clearly to their fundamental fear, and to draw out without evasion the lessons from those difficulties. And as you'll remember from those 9 factors of mind fitness, this fear mitigation is one of those that comes up as we develop more mindfulness and the ability and the courage to show up for our lives. The second key to resilience, to change resilience, is a deep belief or confidence or faith that our lives are truly meaningful. And resilient people have an open-mindedness, creativity, faith necessary to find positive meaning in the traumatic experiences of their lives. And I think we can all probably remember back to some time in our life where there was some trauma or challenge that we faced, and that we were able to find some deep meaning in that really allowed us to not be overwhelmed, but to garner the resilience that we needed to face that circumstance and to come out more whole, or even with a greater confidence in ourselves as a result. And the third key to this is a creative spirit that makes do with what is available, that allows us to innovate and improvise and explore new possibilities. We don't become immobilized, but there's this spark of what can I do, what's available. The Special Forces troops we worked with were incredible. If we needed something, they'd go get it or make it or borrow it without telling somebody. I mean, they were incredibly resourceful men. And this notion that resilience people use their creative intelligence and imagination to simulate and evaluate scenarios and to improvise responses to life events that are life-affirming. To me, in these dreadfully challenging times, there's also great excitement at the kind of innovation that's happening. If you go into sites like Wiser Earth and you see all the great social innovations that people are making and the things that people are doing to respond to the challenges of these times, it helps to balance out the sense of dread and overwhelm that is so present for many of us. So, let's see. Now, we've got time to share these, I think. Joanna Macy and Corton's work talks about this as being a time of a great turning, where we're beginning to realize collectively as people on this planet that so many of the old ways of living are just simply not sustainable, and that we're in this time of the meltdown of many of the old assumptions and institutions that we've relied upon, and how do we respond in a resilient, courageous manner to these circumstances? And Joanna, who's a tremendous source of inspiration in our work, recommends 3 primary strategies. And we shared these. We work a lot in Thailand with many of the activists there, trying to build a better country in the midst of the turbulence that's there. And we shared these with them, and people were so heartened by these because, in a sense, it gave them something that they could really focus on rather than just the VUCA chaos of all of the overwhelming factors. So 3 actions here. Actions that slow the damage to the earth and beings, that allow us to just reduce the strain and the pain on ourselves, on the human systems that we're a part of, to slow the damage. And then actions that help us analyze and understand the dynamics of the old systems that we're embedded in, and to begin to create new and wiser alternatives. And the third strategy, to raise consciousness, to deepen the wisdom, creativity, and compassion that we bring to our lives. So we invite you to consider how you might apply these 3 strategies in your own life or in your work, personally or professionally. We found these simple but powerful seeds of a reflective meditation to ask ourselves how we might take action in any of these 3 domains. And I think these are really strong resiliency factors. So let's pause again, see if there's any further questions. We've still got a bit of time. Could probably take at least 2-3 more questions.
Sure. I've got one question that came in. In what ways did you develop those keys to resiliency, and how did you sort through all of the different possibilities?
Through years of our own intensive practice and a lot of deep reflection of how do we most succinctly and effectively convey what we've learned to other people. You know, Michelle and I have studied with hundreds of extraordinary mentors from many disciplines of modern and ancient wisdom traditions. We've spent probably a couple years of our lives in silent contemplative retreats. We've worked with tens of thousands of people. Do we still have the audio here?
Yes.
Okay. In many different diverse circumstances around the world over the years. So we constantly live with this question of what models, what methods, what ways of articulating this work can be most relevant to the people and the populations that we work with. So it's been a lot of experience combined with many inspiring teachers and a lot of deep reflection. The slide that's on the screen here probably came from about 5 years of refinement and contemplation of how do we convey this profound relationship between our inner work and our outer work. The sense that if we build a high quality of relationships, it's more likely to give us greater mind-body integration and harmony rather than turbulence. As we develop more mind-body harmony, it gives us more peace and power, and the capacity to be more mindfully present, which allows us to develop greater insight and intuition, to awaken greater wisdom, and to bring a greater compassion, effectiveness, and creativity to our lives. You know, this simple model came after many iterations and years of contemplating how do we convey how all of these different elements and practices weave together.
There's a lot in the some of the terms that you've used around the deep reflection and deep meaning, or deeply digging deeply into. Is there a strong religious component, or when you talk about the spirit of things or spirituality, is it a religious component to this, or?
I think the work we do is very affirming of people's religious views and beliefs. We work a lot in many very conservative organizations in red states where we'll be quoting chapter and verse as part of the programs, or citing things they've learned in their yoga classes or whatever it may be. So it's affirming of that, but to me it's much more about wholeness and honoring our humanity, and just getting real that we live and exist on many different frequencies and dimensions of human experience, and it's more about wholeness than it is about religion. I think spirituality is an innate dimension of our being. It's the quality of feeling and experience that arises as we experience ourselves as more deeply connected to others and to all creation, and a yearning to live with greater meaning. So that's a very innate dimension. Mm-hmm. With the men with the Army, Brother David Stendelross was one of our guest speakers, and he really affirmed the spirituality of the men's capacity to be willing to give their lives for a cause that was larger than their own, and he really ennobled them at the spirituality of that, being willing to embrace their mission on those terms.
Interesting. Another question here from Paul, who's asked a number of good questions this afternoon. Can whole urban communities learn to think and function in these ways of mindful, deep reflection? And do you guys have any experience with that?
Yeah, I love that question. That is really our deepest heartfelt aspiration, to help cultivate that. And yes, we have experienced that. One community that comes to mind was adjacent to the university where we worked at Thailand, where there had been they had noticed a rising percentage of violence and just a sense of unsafety in the community, and the whole community decided to take on the practice of what they called precepts of ethical principles and mindful practice to guide their daily life, that they would refrain from certain behaviors with that, behaviors such as killing and stealing and lying, and to really take on the precept of caring for each other in non-harming ways and more conscious ways, which required the practice of mindfulness in order to be aware when one was moving away from this kind of behavior that would be supportive of the whole community. And they took that on as a discipline, as an urban community, and strikingly were able to transform the whole environment in which they live.
And there's some fascinating research that's going on of, like the ultimate defense technology of getting, I think, the square root of 1% of a population to engage in mindfulness in meditation practice. This is coming out of the TM tradition, but there's some startling research that shows that people generate more coherence within the field of a community environment, that the crime rates go down, and that there's actually changes that are taking place in the larger field of the population. So I think these are horizons for research for the decades and the centuries to come. But we've definitely seen communities that have learned how to embrace the diversity of different worldviews and traditions that people were a part of, but to live together in a more mindful way. Like when we were in the division at Hewlett-Packard I talked about, there were, I think, 4,000 or 5,000 people in that division. And it was amazing to see the spirit of that learning community come together as they embraced these kinds of practices and integrated them into thinking deeply, reflecting deeply, and working together with greater emotional intelligence and mental discipline.
I think the best way to begin, if one can, to build that kind of a mindful urban community is by starting the revolution, the evolution, lighting the fires in oneself, and then in within one's working groups and organizations, to build a greater senses of presence and to really cultivate wisdom culture with whatever size community one is involved in. The ripples of that, the resonance of that will spread.
Very good. We have
one more question?
Yeah, one more question here from Yan, who's in the business of helping teams diagnose their immunity to change. Is saying that the number one barrier is to change in business is courage, as the environment is always threatening. And do you have any suggestions around that barrier?
I'd say just do whatever you can to build the foundations for as much connectivity and mutual understanding as possible, and in many ways just to declare that there's a breakdown and there's a wish to restore that can be extremely helpful. The practices we found in many organizations, the practices of nonviolent communication are extremely useful to help people connect with people who they're having difficulties with and to work through and resolve issues that may be challenging to them. So there are many practices and disciplines available, and just depending on the circumstance, those resources can be made available. I'd like to invite our listeners, if there are questions that come up or that haven't been answered, or you'd like to talk in more detail about any of these things that we've talked about today, please feel free to contact us. The handout the file we put in the handouts folder gives you a lot of links to more information. You're welcome to give us a call or send us an email. We're currently at our Hawaii office, the 808-889-0056 number, and our website, wisdomatwork.com, all spelled out. There's many links there for contacting us, for finding more information, links to the research,
there's a wealth of information there.
Great. Well, thank you very much on behalf of all of our online listeners today, Joel and Michelle. We really appreciate your time, and it's just fascinating stuff that you've been involved in, and you've got some great stories. It's really interesting. I'd also like to thank everybody who's online joining us today for your time and interest in this session, and to remind you that you'll be receiving a couple of emails from us very shortly that have to do with today's session. The first one, a brief survey where we welcome your feedback and any suggestions that you might have as we strive to make these sessions as beneficial as possible for everyone. And the second email then with instructions on how you'll be able to access the recorded version of this live event to have for you to download to have for your own purposes. And with that, I think that'll conclude today's session, and I would like to thank you all very much for attending again, and have a good day. Thank you.